But we want to talk now in specific about how he's going to start his downswing, and he's going to show you how he can move his hips forward, keep the axis of his shoulder turn centered, and not move back. Mike, how do you do that?
Well, I need to release these accumulators.
Okay.
The left arm and the right arm, and the distance my hands are, the butt end of the club is from my shoulder.
You just heard Mike refer to release of the accumulators. I'll take this time right now to explain to you the concept of the fourth and the first accumulator. I have assembled a spectrum here to help make my point clearer. First, the Golfing Machine book refers to the fourth accumulator as a lever formed between your left arm and your shoulders, as illustrated by the blue angle on the right picture. The book also refers to the first accumulator as the angle formed when the right arm flexes, as evidenced by the yellow line at the right on the right picture. Those two accumulators at the beginning of the downswing would move the butt of the club from approximately 12 inches to the shoulder, incrementally away from the shoulder on the downstroke as they release. If you look at the left picture, this is an example of a golfer on the downswing who is transferring the lower body weight forward but is not releasing the accumulators. That is, the left arm is not pulling away from the shoulders and the right arm is not straightening. As a result, you'll see that the axis of the shoulder turn is beginning to translate or move backwards. To make this point even clearer, you will notice where the right arm bisects the belt. You'll notice in the left picture that it bisects at the right hip. As we move to the middle picture, you'll notice that the fourth accumulator, the angle between the left arm and the shoulders, has released more than the left picture. You'll notice that the right arm is beginning to straighten. Because of that, the right shoulder is farther away from the ground than the picture on the left. Further evidence of the fourth accumulator releasing shows the left arm now as it bisects the belt in the middle of the left leg, or almost to the middle of the left leg. The model, or the picture that we strive to attain here, would be the right picture, and it shows the correct sequence of the fourth accumulator releasing. You can see now that the right shoulder is higher than the two pictures previously, or across the left side of the page. That's made the shoulders now more level to the ground. At the point here where the shaft is level to the ground, the shoulders should be tilted the same angle as the setup, which is the case in the right picture. You'll notice they're more tilted in the left pictures. As the fourth accumulator has released and the right arm has straightened, the yellow line, the third side of the triangle, the yellow line, has become longer. That's kept the right shoulder higher, and because of that, it's kept the axis of the shoulder turn forward.
Okay. Elaborate on that just a little bit more.
Well, many, especially I think some of the better players have a problem where they get their hands at a certain distance from their shoulders on their backswing, and it stays the same distance on the downswing, and their spine starts to tilt back further.
Okay. And what would you prescribe for that if you saw someone turning back correctly but then moving back on the downswing?
Well, the first thing, I'd make sure their accumulators were releasing, so their hands were actually moving away from their shoulder on their downswing, so as the weight moved forward.
So as the weight was transferring forward, if the butt of the club and the handle started moving away from the right shoulder faster, okay, then the golfer's upper body would not go back at the same rate.
As we've been narrating about the positions of the body on the downswing and how the spine continuously changes throughout the swing, it is also important to make people aware of where the hands and arms should be on the downswing. If we look at the pictures from left to right, you can see how the left arm is inside the stance line on the far left picture and progressively moves further and further out until it's outside the stance line on the far right. We would prescribe the second picture from the left, where the left arm is in 20 degrees on the downswing.
Mike and I have included this diagram illustrating the different arm alignments we were referring to. Notice that they're color-coded to match the corresponding plane from the picture before.
To further illustrate our point, here's a catalog of some of the game's best ball strikers, where you can see the left arm is inside the stance line halfway down in the downswing, thus keeping the arms on the circle. As we look at these pictures, we not only see the left arm in, but we also see the beginning of the basic structure to the stack and tilt, where the shoulder plane is still steep, the torso is still bent forward, and the left arm's in.
As we move to these pictures, you'll start to see a lot of similarities between the pictures on this page and the pictures from the previous page. You're seeing the form of the stack and tilt. Specifically, Mike, what are we looking at on this page that defines it as a stack and tilt downswing?
Well, not only is the left arm inside the stance line, but the pitch of the shoulders is still relatively steep.
And what Mike is saying there is that the angle of the shoulders, or the shoulders turning plane, is at a right angle to the amount the torso is tilted over.
And also notice how similar the amount of hip turn is in these pictures.
To further make our point, you'll see a lot of similarities here in the location that the shaft is passing through the bicep. And you'll see that as the left arm is inside the line of the feet, that the shaft is first passing through the middle of the bicep.
I'd like to add that none of these players are trying to keep the club in front of their body. They are only literally just trying to have the hands and arms move with the turn of their body.
Okay, so are you saying then that you can swing back and turn your shoulders in a circle around an axis and not go backwards?
Yes.
And you're saying that you're doing that then by, from the top of your backswing, moving the weight forward, and as you're moving the weight forward, moving the butt of the club and the handle away from the right shoulder incrementally.
Yes.
Okay, that's one piece that we want to make very clear.
Another problem that's tied in with that, understanding the rate that the hips move forward on
Yes.
the downstroke.
Yes, this was recently asked to us by a very good player. When they were trying to understand that the hips are moving forward, they posed the question, so you're saying to just move the hips forward faster, correct? Is that what you're saying?
No, they're moving further forward longer throughout the swing to the finish, not just moving faster forward.
So we want to differentiate between moving the hips forward faster or earlier, between that and continually moving the hips forward evenly throughout the whole swing, the same rate that the handle is moving away from the right shoulder. Okay, that's an important distinguishing characteristic, because if the person moves the weight forward too faster than the handle moves, then the upper body translates back. Okay, and the whole angle of approach shifts, the rate of closure goes up, the whole scenario. What happens now, Mike, if the person does the basic motion backswing, basic checklist, then the weight goes forward, the accumulators release, what happens to the angle of approach?
Comes from the inside, but only the degree that we want on this grid here, not excessively in to out.
Exactly.
It's tracing this arc here rather than just getting thrown out to the right.
To continue layering in detail around the basic structure that Mike and I have laid out, there must be some destination for the arms as they orbit the forward side of the swing. For that, we have included this spectrum illustrating where the right arm should be, or where it can be, when it's parallel to the ground. You'll notice on the left side of the page that the right arm is inside the stance line in the neighborhood of 45 degrees. As we work our way progressively across the spectrum, you'll see on the far right side that the right arm is outside the line of the feet. Mike and I prescribe when the right arm is parallel to the ground that it should be inside the stance line 20 degrees. So now one can see with the diagram at the bottom of the screen, if one looks at the orange line, the downswing would have the left arm inside the stance line 20 degrees, and on the follow-through, the right arm would be inside the stance line 20 degrees. This would be the arms tracing the orange line in the picture at the top of the screen.
Now, and then by pushing your hips forward on the through swing, you're increasing the side tilt, okay, without raising up, keeping the level of inclination constant, right?
Right.
So there you have it, how a golfer can stay centered on the backswing, push his hips forward, increase the side tilt in his spine without going back. Okay, so a golfer can, and I would recommend that they stay centered on the backswing and then go forward with the hips on the downswing, simply put.
Would you say moving these levers or these accumulators faster is an anti-hook move or a hook move?
Would I say? The faster, good question. The faster a person pulled this handle down like this without moving the weight would reduce the amount the person would draw the ball or swing out at the ball. And the faster I moved the hips forward without moving the accumulator would enable me to swing out to the right the most and therefore push and hook the fastest.
Very
Correct?
Good. Right.
Would you like to just one more time tie that together?
Okay, so on my backswing, I'm turning my shoulders in a circle, so I'm keeping my tilt to the left, shoulder turn centered, hand paths in. On my downstroke, I'm moving my hips forward. My accumulators are releasing, or my hands are getting further from my shoulder on my downswing, keeping the club traveling from the inside but not an excessive amount.
Yes.
Pushing my hips further forward as I hit the ball.
Yes.
Keeping my arms on my body.
Yes.
My spine's extending to the right now and
Yes.
back.
Yes.
Maintaining the same inclination from the ground.
Continuing to push the hips forward all the way to the finish as the club recocks and slows the club down.
To help one see clearly the extension of the spine on the follow-through, we've included this spectrum of the finish. If one looks at the left edge of the page or the left side of the spectrum, one will notice the full extension of the spine such that the axis of the shoulder turn actually translated or moved backward. With this type of swing, one would expect the highest angle of ascent of the club off the ground and the maximum transfer of momentum. As you move across the page to the extreme right edge of the page, you will notice that the upper torso is still flexed forward, that the axis of the shoulder turn, as the upper torso has stayed flexed forward, the axis of the shoulder turn has moved forward. With this type of swing, one would expect the angle of ascent to be the shallowest and the least transfer of momentum. Here's a catalog of some of golf's greatest players illustrating the hip motion and the extension of the spine on the finish. First, notice that the hips are fully pressed forward, tucked underneath the torso as illustrated by the red arrows. You'll notice that as the hips are turned 90 degrees in each of these pictures, that the tailbone, if a straight line were drawn down, is over the inside part of the front foot. As you look at the upper torso in these pictures, you'll see that the upper body is extended, not vertical or retaining the forward flex. The reason why it's hard for people to explain the extension in the spine is because the golfer's level of inclination or their tilt towards the ball stays the same throughout the course of the swing. However, the flex of the spine changes throughout the course of the swing. To illustrate that, Mike and I have included these pictures of Gary Player and Ernie Els. You'll see in the left side a conventional setup of the golfer flexed forward. If you look at the second picture of each player, you'll see that if you just look at the upper torso, now the upper torso is actually extended back. To make that point clearer, I cropped out just the upper body in the setup and in the finish of both players. You'll see in the third picture in the traditional golf setup, as illustrated by the red line, that the golfers are in a forward flex or an abduction. In the next picture to the right, on the follow-through, you'll see that both golfers are in an extension. The yellow arrow illustrates the golfer moving from the forward flex to the extension. So, the title of this page reads, "The flex of the spine changes from abduction to extension. Why doesn't the golfer raise up if he's standing up?" The answer is because the hips push forward, putting in a side tilt that's equal to the amount the golfer is extending the spine.
The poorest players, this is important to understand, the poorest players, they don't know that at all. They keep the same forward bend through the whole swing. That's the people whose hips stop, arms bend, the high handicappers. They don't do this motion enough. The best players have acquired the ability to stand up fast, sometimes to the point that they stand up too quickly.
Right.
And they need to know that that is not the wrong motion. They need to know the sequence and the point with which they would learn how to measure that. Okay?
To summarize, Mike and I feel like the biggest problem facing golfers is that the bottom of the swing is behind the ball. This is often the case because the weight moved back on the backswing and did not move forward fast enough on the downswing. As a result, the golfer pulls the arms apart to keep from hitting behind the ball. Compounding this problem is the golfer is not trained properly on how to push the hips forward enough and to extend the spine enough. This compound problem results in masses of golfers with their arms pulling apart and the hips back too far. It's the hips pushing forward and the belt raising simultaneously through the ball that allows the hips to continue turning.
So then, Mike, can I ask you this question? If you go forward on your backswing a little bit, do you have to go back on your downswing?
No.
Okay, and how would you do that?
I just keep my weight more forward.
You just keep moving it forward all the way, right?
Right.
So if he went a little forward on his backswing, okay, and then continued to push his hips forward and release his accumulators, he would just have, all he would have really done is moved this point a little more forward, this point of tangency a little more forward. What effect would that have?
Be able to draw the ball or push it just a little bit more without moving my centers back.
So you can go forward on the backswing and go more forward on the downswing.
Right.
You do not have to go back on the backswing to go forward.
Right.
Very good. As we mentioned throughout the course of the backswing, the golfer is side tilting and turning so that his shoulders are in a circle. And then we mentioned that he had fully raised up. If one were to view the golfer from this view at the top of the backswing, Mike is fully extended. As he turns back down through the time and space of the swing, by the time he reaches the point where the shaft is parallel to the ground, that's the only time in Mike's swing when he is in the same flexion. This is the only moment in his swing when he's in the same flexion as his setup. Because throughout, if you go back to the backswing, throughout the backswing, he was going like this and like this. Okay? As he begins turning back down through the time and space of the swing, the only time he is back in that original bend, if his axis is stable, if his shoulders are turning a right angle to his spine, the only time that he is in that bend is the point where the shaft is parallel to the ground. Now, as he continues past the point where he's parallel to the ground, he will pass the point where he was bent at the setup, and he will start moving towards an extension in the spine. This way, okay, throughout the course of his backswing. But that would make the golfer, okay, one more time, Mike, that would make the golfer appear to raise up, right? But he doesn't raise up the level of inclination because from the front, his hips are continuing to push forward, putting a side tilt in the spine to the right, which keeps the right shoulder turning on a rotated plane through the ball.
To help make our point clear, we have included this spectrum illustrating the changes in the flex of the spine and how the hip slide affect the swing's path through the ball. This is our friend Tommy Armour, and on the left you see that the shaft is actually lowering and the hands are coming across the ball. You'll notice that if you look at his left leg that the left leg has straightened the earliest and pulled back the fastest. As that happened, the upper body's axis of the shoulder turn has moved forward, retaining the forward tilt. It is the retention of this forward tilt with the hips going backward that is making the shaft stay down or actually lower through the ball. The pattern or flight of the ball that one might expect with this type of procedure would be pulls, cuts, and deflected slices. As you move across the page to the middle picture, you'll see that the hips have pushed more forward and are open less. You'll also notice that that's easy to see by looking at the left leg. You'll notice that there's no space visible and that the left leg is not as straight. As the hips pushed more forward, that tilted the spine to the right as viewed from the front. This lowers the right shoulder through the ball, and you see how it makes the shaft stay more on a plane or not moving as much to the left. or moving as much across the ball as the left picture. This will give the ball a straighter initial start line. As we move to the picture on the right, this is an example of a person who's moving the hips forward but actually releasing the forward tilt too early. The characteristics of this swing is that the shaft would actually raise up through the ball, directing the path of the club outward. The pattern with this flight of the ball would be pushes, draws, and overdraws.
A little bit of detail there for all you guys, but I hope you got and understand how this spine is changing flex, that this is not the wrong movement. It's the sequence of this movement that needs to be clearly understood. As one begins to learn more about their golf swing, there's a couple of terms that Mike and I would like for the golfer to become familiar with. First, as Mike sets up here, the first term a golfer should understand is the angle of descent. And that would be the angle with which the club comes into the ground. So if we were to look at Mike's swing, one would understand the angle of descent by watching my club here. And as I make it increase its angle to the ground, that would be a steeper descent. And as it lowers, this would be a shallower descent. Next, we would like for you to understand the angle of ascent, okay? That would be the path that Mike's club travels upward after impact. This being a shallow ascent, and this being a steeper ascent. Third, there would be another angle that a golfer should become aware of as they begin to understand their swing, and that would be the angle of approach. This is often referred to loosely as the swing's path. The angle of approach, if this was the target line, would be the angle with which the club's path comes into the ball. This would be a more acute angle of approach, and progressively this would be a less acute angle where the path is actually coming straighter into the ball to the point that the club could actually be swung and coming across the ball. The follow through could be the same way. As Mike swings up on his finish, the angle of his follow through could go in either direction as well. It could go to the right, or it could go to the left, or it could go directly up the angle of the inclined plane. Now, these terms become important, especially when we start to move to the driver. Mike, why would you say that's important?
Well, first of all, you don't want to hit the driver into the ground. So you have to have some sort of control over the angle of ascent on the through swing.
And the angle of descent on the downswing,
Absolutely.
Correct? And what the point Mike's making here is that the best players, there's a concept that we use called negative and positive loft. And it becomes very important when you begin to talk about the low lofted clubs. First, the higher lofted clubs, the 7s, 8s, 9s, and pitching wedges, all the best players, when they hit the ball, play those clubs with negative loft. In other words, if they have a 40-degree club, when they actually hit the ball, it's launched at 34, 35 degrees. They hit the ball with the lofted clubs with less loft than they're actually holding, hence the term negative loft. But when you get down to the driver and the 3-iron and the low lofted clubs off the ground, the players hit the ball sometimes with true loft or even positive loft. For instance, Mike is going to launch this driver, a 9-degree club, at 10 or 11 or 12 degrees of loft. So it's important to understand here the difference between negative and positive loft. Now, Mike, will you explain to me in those terms, when you hit this low lofted club, how you do that?
Well, first, I'm going to take my hand path in on my backswing, keeping my centers in line with the ball or the center of my stance. I'm not going to shift my weight back.
Now, sorry Mike, but just under the pretense of hitting the ball up in the air, A lot of people have been instructed in the past to hit the ball in the air that one has to move their either both parts, one or both parts of their weight back, that being the lower body, okay, or just the upper body, or both. If Mike shows, or both. We prescribe that you do neither, that you turn your shoulders in a circle around the axis as we previously discussed. That would be the basic stack and tilt procedure. But, okay, Mike, one should understand now as the clubs change, the ball positions change, and the distance from the ball has changed, Mike, one should understand how to recognize and control the angle of descent and the angle of ascent. Mike, will you talk about how that's happening?
Well, the first thing, if I do my shoulder turn where it's centered, my hands are in, the start of my downswing, the hips moving forward or my weight moving linear longer will help the angle of approach and the angle of descent be more from the inside and a shallower angle of descent.
So what you're saying then, Mike, is the more you move your hips forward, you're producing a tilt sideways in your spine, and the effect that that's having is shallowing the angle of descent. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, simultaneously, as you're doing that, moving the hips forward, increasing the tilt of the spine incrementally throughout the time and space of the swing, that's also controlling the angle of approach. Is that correct?
Correct.
What would happen if you came down, Mike, as you swung to the top, and you came down and your hips did not move forward enough?
The club would start swinging out more across the ball and the angle of descent would get steeper.
The angle of descent would get steeper and the club would start swinging across the ball more. Okay, can we illustrate that a little more clearly? If Mike's hips do not continue pushing forward, one more time please, if they do not push forward incrementally throughout the course of the downswing, the moment that they stop pushing forward, okay Mike, one more time please, the moment that the hips stop pushing forward is the moment that the club will start to tip out off the incline plane because Mike's side tilt stops kicking in at the correct rate. So we'll elaborate on that one more time just to make sure you got it. Here we go to the top again. Mike's hips are going to move forward. His handle comes away from his right shoulder. As his hips move forward, it puts a side tilt in his spine. That's, as he does that incrementally through the downswing, that's controlling the angle of descent. Okay, second, as he does that, as Mike moves his hips forward, the side tilt is kicking in, it's also holding this shaft on the plane. If Mike's hips stop moving forward for any second and only go rotary without any linear force, the club shaft starts to tip over the plane and the angle of descent starts to get steeper into the ball. That's the first piece you need to know about your downswing and how to control the angle of descent and the angle of approach.
And just so it's clear, you can have this tilt increase in your spine one of two ways. You can push your hips forward, which starts to change the tilt of the spine, or you can move your head backwards like this. We're prescribing to keep the center of the shoulder turn right in the center of the stance and only move the hips forward to change the tilt in the spine.
Correct. Mike, what would be the ramifications of someone, or what would happen to someone's swing if they did it another way and they moved the center of the shoulder turn back and then they came down with the center of the shoulder turn back? What happens to the swing?
The angle of approach would start to become very sharp from the inside.
More acute, correct?
Angle of descent would become very shallow.
And what would be the likely hits on the ball then? What would be the scenario?
Straight pushes,
Straight
overdraws,
pushes, yes. And what kind of contact on the face of the club?
some toe hits.
And how about the contact on the height of the club from top to bottom?
Very low on the face.
Thinner hits. Thinner hits. Now, as the
You see
club...
people do that where they drop kick some of their drivers,
Exactly.
hit the ground even behind the ball.
Exactly. Now, this has been become a common practice as people have made the clubs bigger, as technology has increased, the clubs have become deeper, and it's become a common practice actually in some teaching circles to have to tee the ball up higher to hit the ball high enough on the club face to make this club perform? Well, the person who's tilting or translating the axis of this shoulder turn back too far is making the angle of approach out too much. They're making the angle of descent too shallow, and they're going to hit the ball on the bottom of the club. We want you to understand how to hit the ball with the correct angle of approach, the correct angle of descent, but hit the ball high enough on the club so that it launches at the optimum spin rate. There's been a lot of discussion, especially with the advent of satellite technology, about measuring the spin rate. Mike, will you just elaborate then, once you've hit the ball, elaborate how the golfer then is controlling the angle of ascent, which is the angle that the club comes up out of the ground on the follow-through.
Well, the first thing, as my hips continue to move linear forward here, the spine angle increases where there's this extension. That's the first piece that's going to help get the club out of the ground on the through swing.
As you're doing that, what's happening to the level of your belt in relation to the ground?
If my belt was 36 inches from the ground at address, as I'm hitting the ball, the belt is, or the hips are raising up to the point when I finish, they'd be about 2 inches higher than that. So they're raising up.
To illustrate the progression of the hips moving forward, the level of the belt raising, and the spine extending, Mike and I have included this spectrum. You'll see on the left side of the page, the golfer has turned through the ball, the hips have stayed down, the weight has stayed back, and the arms have flexed too quickly. A very common problem among poor golfers. As we work our way across the page, if you just look at the lower body, you'll see how progressively the hips have pressed more and more forward and the level of the belt has raised. You'll also notice that as the level of the belt has raised and the hips have pushed forward, that the spine is beginning to extend backward. As the spine continues to extend, the arms stay straighter longer. The instructions for this progression was for our student to A, tuck the butt under the torso and keep the arms straight in the manner of punching a ball.
And that's part of the standing up motion that we alluded to earlier in the tape, the extending of the spine as viewed in this from this angle. Okay, so as Mike is pushing his hips forward, extending his spine, he's actually raising his belt to the ground.
The top two pictures here is an example of a player not extending their spine. The hips are not pressed forward. The spine is not extended, which starts to produce a pattern where the wrists begin to uncock, and as the wrists uncock, the player starts flexing their arms to prevent from hitting the ground too hard. The lower pictures are an example of a player pushing their hips forward. The spine begins to extend, which leads to the arms staying straight longer.
The function of that is to increase the angle of ascent off the ground of the club, okay? So first, if you were to demonstrate the steepest angle of ascent, first thing you said you would be doing would be pushing the hips forward, raising the belt, extending the spine, correct?
Correct.
Okay, then what else?
As my arms are straight after impact, then the wrists are starting to recock faster as well.
Correct.
So the recocking the club is going to get the club out of the ground faster.
Correct. So if you came through, Mike, and you hit the ball and you never recocked the club, that would restrict to a certain level the angle of ascent. But as you did that, if you recocked the club the fastest and pushed your hips forward, raised your belt, extended your spine, stretched your legs upward to the highest degree, one would be able to create the steepest angle of ascent. And now, if a person had a sound angle of approach, a sound angle of descent, okay, Mike, and they did these variables, what would be the corresponding launch angle on the ball with a steeper angle of ascent?
Steeper angle of ascent would launch the ball at a higher angle.
And it would launch the ball at a higher angle because what would it be doing to the loft of the club?
It would actually be adding some loft to it.
So you'd be hitting the ball with these low lofted clubs with more positive loft as opposed to negative loft. Now, Mike, would you say that to change the angle of ascent and hit the ball with positive loft, that you had to move your centers back on your backswing?
No, I left them the same.
And are you saying then that you can hit the ball with the highest launch without moving your centers back on the backswing?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Here's a spectrum of the extension in the spine, beginning with the player on the left, who's retaining some of the original tilt forward, all the way across to the right where the player has full extension in the spine.
You'll notice if you look from the bottom of the picture on the left, you'll notice that the right knee is still flexed. As you move across the page, you'll notice in the right picture that the right knee is straightened. As the right knee is straightened, you'll notice that the height of the belt to the ground has raised, as evidenced by the yellow line. There's some confusion sometimes in golf regarding how to hit the ball high. Is this standing up or raising the belt an extension of the spine that increases the angle of ascent that enables the highest trajectories?
And this also increases the club head's speed.
There's an important alignment in the golf swing that Mike and I want to make sure that everyone understands. And it's a term that is defined from the Golfing Machine book in Homer Kelly. And the term that we want to make, the concept we want to make very clear is the what the book refers to as the flying wedge. And that flying wedge is, if you just view it on a horizontal plane, that flying wedge is the angle of the right wrist bend that's established at the setup by the fact that the butt of the club is ahead of the leading edge, and at the leading edge of the club. We discussed how earlier how golf being played on an inclined plane means that the handle of the club is ahead of the leading edge, which is in effect establishing this right wrist bend, or what we'll call the flying wedge. Now, this flying wedge, we want to show you how that flying wedge stays intact throughout the swing. Mike's going to set up with the setup.
At address, you can see that there's an angle between the shaft and my right arm. It's not like in a straight line here.
Exactly. So, and if Mike were to have more flying wedge or more negative loft, he would have a sharper angle here. Okay, so that's just the degree of the flying wedge. Okay, now, ready? So if Mike sets up, he puts a little bit more in there. Okay, now everyone sees this angle. That's the angle we're referring to as the flying wedge. This angle has a very important role in controlling the path of the club and also the width of the arc of the swing. And as Mike holds that set up for a second, I'm just going to stand on a horizontal plane for just a second, okay? And everyone sees the wedge. And I want you to understand that as Mike swings this club coming through the ball, that this wedge is going to remain stable like this. He is not going to uncock his right wrist when he hits the ball like that, because if he does uncock his right wrist as he hits the ball, losing his wedge, what he's going to be doing is, first, making the width of the arc of the swing get wider. So his club's going to bottom out farther behind the ball. Okay? Another piece that in so doing, as the right wrist flattens out, is the angle of descent into the ball starts to get shallower. As the angle of descent gets shallower, the bottom of the arc moves back. Okay? Now this is very common in poorer players. They uncock the right wrist, throw away the flying wedge. The lowest point of the swing is moving backward, and then to keep from hitting behind the ball, they pull their arms apart. Okay? And what they get then are thin shots, okay? Low line drives, low spin, thin shots. This is very common with the high handicap players, and the evidence of that is the follow through whenever you see the arms very close to the side. So if you were to just take a simple illusion viewed on a horizontal plane of the right wrist, and you see it coming through the ball, you would understand then that this right wrist has to be frozen. There can be no uncocking like this without shallowing the descent of the club and moving the bottom of the arc back. Okay,
If you
now
want to do the smallest, shortest version of a stack and tilt swing, that would be a chip shot.
yeah,
With the weight in front of the golf ball, on or slightly in front of the golf ball, the angle of the right wrist and of the shaft right arm form an angle. flying wedge here. Keep that locked. Keep my weight forward. Wrist angles locked, arms straight.
You can see coming through the ball now that Mike still has an angle between his right arm and his shaft. What would happen, Mike, if you came through and you actually, because this is a very common practice with good players, as they come through, is the angle of the right wrist actually increases slightly. Mike, what is the net result of someone who increased that angle?
Well, the angle of descent's going to increase.
Get steeper.
Steeper. Angle of approach will stay slightly from the inside more.
Marginally more from the inside, slightly steeper as one increased the flying wedge.
Here we have a diagram of the handle location being back. The blue line at a right angle to the handle location being back illustrates the corresponding effect on the line of compression. With this handle location being back, the line of compression moving across the ball, making it easier for the golfer to hit the outside quadrant of the ball. Here you see a diagram of the handle location being forward for whatever reason. At a right angle to the forward handle location is the corresponding effect on the line of compression. You'll see that as the handle location moves forward and outward, the line of compression shifts to the right. With this handle location, it will be easier, therefore, to swing into out at the ball.
How many really good players, or what's the pattern with the player's skill level if they throw away the flying wedge?
That would be the highest handicappers. As the
And-
handicaps go down, their ability to not throw that angle out there improves.
I think there's a direct proportion to that. Okay, now, if we were to go back then and to start with the setup and trace this throughout the backswing, you see the angle, and Mike might even make a swing here with just his right arm. Okay, if he takes his left arm off the club, okay, you can see how coming through how the flying wedge is staying intact. But now I'm going to take him all the way through his backswing. Okay, if he does his setup, okay, and takes his left arm off the club, we'll be able to, if he just swings back here like halfway back, okay, you can see that there's an angle formed in his right wrist. Okay, that angle that the shaft is sitting on is the flying wedge. If Mike throws out his wrist bend, okay, uncocks his wrist, sorry Mike, go ahead again. If Mike uncocks his wrist, you can see the flying wedge is gone. If Mike bends his right wrist, you can see the flying wedge is intact. Okay, one more time please, Mike, on that. Keep the club pointed at the plane. Keep the flying wedge. Okay, now as he comes down, you can see he has his flying, as he goes onto the top of his backswing, you can see that his right wrist is bent at the top of his backswing. Okay, it is not flat like that. That means he has his wedge. Okay, now throughout the course of the downswing, if he comes down, you see when his arm is parallel to the ground, where his left arm would be parallel to the ground, okay, that his right wrist is still bent, okay? He still has his angle of his setup. You can see this, the similarities in Mike's shaft and my shaft, the flying wedge. Now, as Mike comes down to where the shaft is parallel to the ground, you can still see here how his right wrist is bent, okay? It is not flattened out, okay? And as he comes through the ball, his hips continuing to turn and push forward helps him sustain this angle in his right wrist. If he comes down, okay, Mike, okay, go back up to parallel to the ground with the shaft. If he comes down and his hips stop moving forward, okay, the moment that his hips stop moving forward, okay, then the flying wedge starts to come out, and what does that do to the path of the club?
Throws the club outside my hands and across the golf ball.
So, well, the loss of the wedge would shallow the descent, and the rotation in the joints of the arm, okay, the turning in the joints of the arm would start to throw his club to the outside of the circle on the ground. One more time on that, please, Mike. That would be incorrect. That would be correct. And now, as he goes through to this follow through, okay, very important here, okay, if Mike were to swing this time, Mike, and he's going to turn around and swing towards the camera. Yeah, as he comes up to the follow through, you'll be able to see from the caddy view here how he has his wrist bent, and as he reaches the point where his right arm is parallel to the ground, you can still see the flying wedge is present. It is not thrown out like that. Okay, so what we want you to see from the perspective of the flying wedge is how the right wrist stays bent throughout the course of the swing, how there's no flattening of the swing, no flattening of the wrist, but also how there's no rotation, excessive rotation in the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist, because if there is rotation in the shoulder and the elbow and the wrist, the radial alignment of the swing, okay, is changed. And when one starts changing the rotation in these joints, that would make the path come into the ball more across the ball if they turned the shoulder, the elbow, or the wrist. Okay?
Important detail, if somebody had the problem of throwing that angle or the wedge out of their golf swing, when they begin to practice having the handle forward, maintaining this wedge on their throughout their golf swing, especially through their finish, often the time is the club face starts to open up as they practice that, so the ball does not draw, it starts cutting still a little or pushing the ball too far to the right. So it's important to know that as the handle staying forward, that club face is also staying square to this arc.
Very important there, because a lot of people confuse the right wrist bend staying the same angle with what would be termed a reverse roll, or a rolling of the wrists coming through the ball, and that's not to be confused. The flying wedge is just the angle of the right wrist keeping the face square to the circle. So if Mike were to swing on this arc right here, okay, and he were to come through, his face as he comes through with the flying wedge would keep tracing the circle. You see how it's turning in relation to the ground. You see the face is turning in relation to the ground. Many times people confuse this, okay, one more time, with a reverse roll, which means that his sweet spot is now looking more up in the air. So when people practice this concept, oftentimes they start getting an uncentered hit with the ball going to the right.
Often the time is people look at a picture of a good player on their follow through, and they mistake this picture here for someone releasing the club or going like this.
Correct, correct.
What they do see is a person turning on their through swing, maintaining the wedge, and the fingers of the left hand look like they're lower than the hand of the right hand.
And what they think has happened is that the club is actually rolled over, but you see very clearly here how Mike's arms, there's no rotation in his wrists. As I can place my fist right in between his arms, there's no rolling in his joints there. If he were to roll those over, it would look like that. Okay, so one more time on that, please, Mike. So as Mike's coming through the ball, it's important to understand the face's relationship to the path, how it's staying uniform, square to the arc all the way through, and how it's doing that by the arms. There's no rotation in the arms, okay, disturbing the alignment of the shaft, and there's no release in the wrist bend, disturbing the angle of descent into the ball. Mike and I went over the basic pieces of the stack and tilt with regard to the backswing. We talked about how the spine tilting to the left controls the shoulder turn, how the flexing and straightening, the flexing of the front leg and the straightening of the back leg allows the hips to turn. So we went over the shoulder, we went over the hips, we went over the knees. We talked about how the front foot, the feet are turned out. Now we need to talk about the orbit of the hands as they orbit around the body. We need to talk about them with respect to the angle that they travel on, and as we look at the golfer from the caddy view, the ascent that they go on. Okay, first, if we were looking from down the line, when Mike begins his stack and tilt backswing, he's side tilting to the left, his shoulder is therefore going down, his front knee is flexing, his back knee is straightening, allowing his hips to turn. What this does is, one more time please, Mike. This allows Mike's hands to travel on a tilted angle, okay? Now, there's some accurate references for a person who wants to get the hands to travel on the backswing angle that we use for the stack and tilt. The checkpoints first would be as Mike goes back to the point where the shaft is parallel to the ground, and as he continues back just a little bit farther, you'll notice if he stops right there that the hands pass through his body right at the edge of his belt, okay? Now, as he continues going back, you'll notice that the hands pass through his body, the backside of his body at the base to the middle of his bicep, okay? This is establishing the angle that Mike's hands are moving on throughout the course of the backswing. Now, as Mike continues flexing and straightening his knee, turning his hips and shoulders, flexing his right arm, without lifting any of the limbs, as he reaches the end of his backswing, his hands will be behind his right shoulder, not above it. Because anything above his arm, anything where the butt of the club comes up to in line with the shoulder, would be his arms lifting off of his rib cage. Now, we have a lot of guys that have adopted this procedure, and one of the things that they've done to learn this hand path, once they get the structural part right of the side tilt and the linkage of the legs, is they put T's underneath their arms to help them to get the feel for the correct hand path and not lifting the arms on the backswing. Okay, one more time on that please, Mike. Very good. Now, if we take the picture that Mike is doing and we've just narrated the trajectory of the hands and given the golfer some references for that, now we'd like to watch this swing also from the front view because it's important to understand the ascent of the hands. Okay, now, if this is the level of the club when Mike sets up, okay, whenever he swings back, he's going to side tilt to the left, and as he does that, the butt of the club is making an ascent on the backswing. Okay, it is not moving the same level to the ground like that, or even lowering. Okay, so Mike, if Mike does the first one incorrectly, you'll see the butt of the club lower, the shoulders turn to level. Okay, now, when he does it correctly, the side tilt kicks in, the left shoulder lowers, and the hand path, one more time please, Mike, makes an ascent. Okay, much like almost a circle of the hands as they move back, up, back,
and
up,
inward.
and in on the backswing. The back, up, and in controlled by the side tilt, the simultaneous flexing of the front leg, straightening of the back leg. The point to be learned here is that the side tilt to the left is enabling the butt of the club to raise up without having to flex the arms or pull the arms in closer to the body. Okay, so what you should understand then is that on the backswing, the side tilt to the left helps to regulate the angle of ascent of the hands on the backswing. Second, you should have an idea, the player should have an idea of the angle of inclination, the angle that the hands will orbit on throughout the course of the backswing, and have some checkpoints for that. Okay, we narrated those. Mike, will you demonstrate those one more time, please?
So as I side tilt to the left, the hands are not only moving inward with the turn of my body, but they're also going up.
So they're moving all three dimensions there, correct?
Correct, not staying the same distance from the ground.
So they're moving back, up, and in all at the same time.
Now just the opposite on the through swing.
Okay.
Through swing, the hips as they're pushing forward, spine angle changes, it's tilting to the right, the handle of the club will start raising up from the ground here. As my body's turning, hands are going and the club are moving up away from the ground and back inward, tracing this incline again.
Tracing the incline. The body is releasing its tilt as we've talked about. The hands are traveling back, up, and in on the follow-through. The inward part is a result of the body turning and the arms staying on the orbiting body, or the hands going around the body, the arms staying on the body that's turning. Now, one more time on that, please, Mike. So if Mike does this on the follow-through, if we're ready, you'll notice from the back, if he stops right there, that when his arm is parallel to the ground, sorry, Mike, that when his arm is parallel to the ground, it is not along his stance line. Everybody see how his arm is inside of his stance line. Okay? Now, an accurate check would be at the same point on the backswing. Ready? When Micah's arm is parallel on the backswing, you see how his arm is not on the stance line on the downswing as well. The arm is inside the stance line. Okay, so now as Mike sets up again and demonstrates this, it goes in on the backswing. Okay, it comes back down. It's still in when it's parallel to the ground on the downswing. Okay, and then when as he continues through the ball, releases his tilt, keeps his arms on his body. When the right arm is parallel to the ground on the downswing, the right arm is inside the stance line as well. This is Mike swinging his hands and arms on a tilted plane in a circle. That would be for straightaway shots, okay, with the corresponding face angle alignment. So with those pieces, understanding then the hand path on the backswing, downswing, and follow through, some checkpoints for the golfer, and then also understanding how the path of the hands when they orbit the body is backward, upward, and inward, 3 dimensions. Okay? As the golfer understands, first of all, throughout the course of the backswing, what the body is supposed to do, that is the side tilt to the left, controlling the shoulder plane and the axis of the shoulders, how the legs, front leg flex and the back leg straightens and the hips turn, the golfer begins to see a picture in their mind of how the body's supposed to act. We've also then began to talk about how the hands begin to trace the circle on the ground, which is the inclined plane. Now, last, we need to explain the path of the shaft, because sometimes people get confused about the path of the hands and the path of the club. If Mike were to do a practice swing here and go ahead and set up again and do his backstroke without a club, we could accurately see just the path of the hands as they orbit the body. Now, sometimes people get confused and their coach or their friend tells them that they're taking it, quote unquote, taking it back too far inside, and the student is confused as to what they're taking back too far inside. Well, it's easy to see here how as Mike swings back that his hands should be moving in an arc on the inclined plane, like that. What we want to address now is as Mike's hands continue to trace the plane and stay on the body and not lift off the body, we want to address what controls the angle of the shaft as it goes around the body, okay? Go ahead and set up there, please, Mike. Now, Mike is setting up here, when he sets up the angle between his shaft and his club, if he just sets it right here on the point here of our arc, he has an angle between his arm and his shaft here, and we're just going to say, for whatever reason, that this is a 135-degree angle. Okay, now, throughout the course of his backswing, this 135-degree angle is going to hinge, just hinge it straight up, please, Mike, to like 90 degrees as a baseline. It's going to go vertical like that, so you have a vertical force for the shaft. But also, as he swings back, okay, Mike, if you just swing back and you have no wrist cock, okay, and Mike continues turning, and that 135 stays 135, the club's always going to start going back too low to the ground, because as we swing back, the wrist angle has to increase throughout the course of the backswing. So you're going to see this 135, one more time please, Mike, to by the halfway point of the backswing, stay 135 or even decrease in that example, okay? Now Mike, show us the correct version where it goes 135 to 90. He's going to increase his wrist cock incrementally to the point that when his left arm is parallel to the ground, his wrists are hinged about 90 degrees. Okay, one more time there, Mike. Like that. Now show us, Mike, what happens if you swing back and you actually uncock the wrists on the backswing. The club always goes in too much. Okay, and show us what happens if you're someone like Kenny Perry and you actually hinge the wrists faster than you go inward. keep going, keep going, keep going. You see how the wrist and the shaft plane is nearly vertical to the ground. Now do the same takeaway, Mike, but to go ahead and take the hands in and make the wrist angle steeper. You see how the hands trace the correct angle there, but the shaft is now setting on a steeper plane. There's Mike tracing the angle of the plane, but with the wrist cock slightly faster than the model, making the shaft be too vertical. Okay, one more time.
Correctly?
Correctly. Okay, incorrectly.
To illustrate the variables controlling the shaft plane, Mike and I have included this spectrum of players, all demonstrating similar hand paths where the hands pass through the body at the base to the mid of the bicep. You'll notice as you move across the screen, the shaft moves from the most level to the ground to the most vertical. A closer examination will show that in the left picture that the left wrist is turned the most, as it's the most facing the sky. And if you move across the page, you'll see in the yellow sweater, Johnny Miller, the most vertical shaft, how the left wrist has barely turned any degrees at all. The point here is to begin to notice how the rotation of the left wrist, left elbow, and left shoulder in the left picture are making the shaft its most level. Conversely, the picture on the right, the left shoulder has turned down more, the left wrist has turned less, making the shaft more vertical. So, just to reiterate, similar hand paths, different shaft planes, as caused by the rotation in the joints of the left shoulder, left elbow, and left wrist.
Now you'll notice as Mike is taking in that swing, as he uncocked his wrist, he also added some rotation in the joints here of his left shoulder, left elbow, and left wrist, like in the manner you've seen Raymond Floyd's swing at some points in his career, where he actually rotated the joints in his arms, and as he did that without any or with minimal wrist, with vertical action in the wrists, okay, as he rotated the joints in his arms, the club went back the lowest to the ground and the most behind him. Okay, now if you did the same, if you wanted to demonstrate the opposite of that, one would demonstrate Kenny Perry, okay, and you can see the angle of ascent of the club head is going the straightest up in the air with minimal rotation in the joints, and now one can see the shaft getting steeper to the ground. Okay, so the point to be learned here is that the factors that are in control of the angle of the shaft on the backswing are how much the wrists hinge vertically versus how much the arms rotate as the body controls the ascent of the hand path. Now, what a golfer would like to do to be able to swing this club back is to incrementally, as he turns back on his backswing, increase the angle of the wrists as he's turning through the time and space of the swing, such that when he sets up, he's got a 135-degree angle on the setup from this view, okay, from the down the line view, approximately. And as we go back to the point where he's halfway back on the backswing with this side tilt, he's got like 90-degree angle by the time the arm is parallel to the ground. That would be an accurate checkpoint for the rate that the wrist cock is loading on the backswing.
While we're going over some of the variables or details of the driver's swing, I think it's important to note that all the mechanics in the stack and tilt are the same throughout the bag. Whether we're hitting a pitching wedge or a driver, the basic motion's still going to remain the same. The centered shoulder turn, the tilt, the knee flex, the hand pass, those are all staying the same throughout every shot. What is changing is some of these small details and understanding how to control them.
We want to elaborate just a little bit more on what happens to a person and why the swing is the way it is. Okay, so when Mike sets up, if he swings back and for whatever reason, intentional or unintentional, he moves his shoulder turn backward on his backswing, that's created a tilt to the side, or a side tilt. Now, if he were to come down and he were to have an excessive amount of side tilt, when he swings, his shoulder, as he comes through the ball, gets closer and closer to the ground. That makes the radius, or the width, the circumference of his swing get smaller and smaller. So the distance of the circumference of his swing is getting smaller and smaller. That makes the club head speed, or the transfer of momentum on the club, less and less and less. This would be the slowest way to swing. Would you demonstrate how, if a person is tilted back, the circumference of the swing staying, the wrist staying hinged, the spine staying tilted like this through the ball, would be the slowest possible way to swing in terms of mile per hour. But if Mike keeps his center stable, increases as he moves his weight forward, his handle moves away from his shoulder, as he comes through, the radius is stretching back out as the wrists and arms uncock. That is allowing the width or circumference of the swing to stretch out, increasing the mile per hour on the club. So even the biggest, tallest player, the 6'4" golfer, okay, who under the pretense of hitting the ball a long way, moves his back axis back because the rocket scientists are telling him he has to swing upward at the ball to hit it, to launch it high enough.
With no spin.
With no spin, correct. As he moves his axis back under that pretense, and he keeps increasing the tilt in his spine, the circumference of his swing is getting shorter and shorter. The transfer of momentum is becoming less and less and less as he does that. So his club head speed is diminishing, not increasing, it is diminishing. He is also, as he does that, go ahead, Mike, increasing the angle of ascent, but by moving the center of his turn back, he is multiplying, when he comes through, the rate that his club face can turn over. So the golfer who swings back, tilts his spine back, the right shoulder then stops the earliest. As the golfer moves this way, the shoulder stops the earliest. And when that shoulder stops, this club turns over. This is how the players with the most tilt, because they move the axis back, hit the ball the highest or the lowest.
The long club's the lowest.
The long club's the lowest. So will you demonstrate that, please, Mike?
Okay.
So the point here is that as Mike does this, is under the pretense of having the most tilt to hit the ball the highest, the golfers have often translated their axis of their shoulder turn backward. As they've done that, their right shoulder stops moving. When their right shoulder stops moving, the club face begins to turn over. That term of the club turning over to the rate that the club is turning over, we'll call the rate of closure. One more time.
So this club has this driver here has 9.5 degrees of loft. If my hands begin to turn over, I'm taking what little loft that club has to begin with
and de-lofting.
Correct.
So then, Mike, are you saying that the more the axis of the shoulder turn is back, the more that stops the right shoulder, the more that increases the rate of closure and slows down the mile per hour of the club?
Correct.
Okay, that's what I wanted to get clear. So the reason why the sack and tilt swing is the way it is so that, Mike?
We control the angle of descent and the angle of approach. Those are stable because you have control over where these centers are.
Which centers are you talking about?
Center of the shoulders, center of the hips, which are controlling this path of this club and angle of descent.
And while you're on that, controlling the centers and the precision of controlling the plane of the swing, the precision of controlling the plane of the swing, which, as we have discussed earlier, the plane of the swing is actually, when transcribed on the ground, this circle. Will you just discuss for me how the shoulder turn staying centered supplies the precision of this circle in a little more detail?
Well, if I move my shoulder turn back behind the original mark, I'm no longer swinging on that original circle. So now I'm swinging on a different plane altogether. Even though from down the line it may look like I'm swinging on a perfect plane, I've changed all the rules by moving where that axis is turning. center of the shoulder turn, staying centered as I move my hands in and turn my body, I can have the precision of keeping this circle intact.
Uniform. Exactly. Thank you for that. We're discussing the elements of the arc of the follow-through, and we want to give you a simple measure to help distinguish the transfer of momentum, or how the club is speeding up, and also start to show how that affects the loft of the club and the angle with which the ball is launched. Mike has just demonstrated the longest possible follow-through arc, and one can see that by how far his swing is reaching here. Okay, now Mike, will you come through again, demonstrating if the club recocks quicker. You see how Mike could swing full speed. If you'd like, I'll stand here. Okay, he recocks the club faster, he won't reach me because the arc is getting shorter. Okay, the follow-through arc is getting shorter as he's recocking that club, and you can hear when he does that, the velocity increasing. Okay, now, there's a simple measure for this particular follow-through arc, and the measurement will start with where the right arm is parallel to the ground.
Well, Andy, we explained one metric in being able to identify the length of this arc and measuring the angle of ascent, which is when the right arm is parallel to the ground, the angle between the right arm and the club shaft. This is 0. This would be 20 degrees, which is what we're prescribing with the driver, 20 to 30 degrees. It would be 90 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
Now, another way of measuring this is the distance the handle is from your body when the arms are parallel to the ground.
Okay.
First, the shortest arc, when I come through, the club is only an inch from my body, almost touching my stomach here. The longest arc, club's almost a foot from my stomach.
Your arms are fully extended and your wrists are recocked the least, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so we want to make sure that the amateur golfer and the beginning golfer that understands that when you're coming through and as you're speeding up this club and then slowing it down and recocking the club, that one gets the very clear understanding that you're not flexing your arms as you hit the ball to do this. Will you just elaborate on that a little bit, Mike?
Even if I'm going to hit the ball the highest, my arms are going to be straight after impact.
Okay, and will you just walk through, not only with the driver, but the basic stack and tilt motion, the way the linkage of the arms as they go through the space of the swing?
Well, as I push my hips forward, my spine angle increases, my body's turning, my arms are still staying right on my body. They're not lifting up in the air at all, so that I continue around on this arc.
And how about the flexion of the arms?
The arms are straight after impact. Both arms are straight. Both arms are still on my torso, not lifting up.
Okay, so your arms are connected to your body, okay, just as they were at the setup with the term through the term we call the golfing machine's pressure points, here and here, okay, and as you go through the space of your swing, those are staying constant. Will you do that please one more time, Mike? So the arms are staying on the torso, they're not flexing yet, and at what point would they begin to flex?
After they reach parallel to the ground.
After the club shaft began to recock, to start to slow the club down, okay? The club is now slowing down. The arms are beginning to flex, and that's further slowing the club down to the stopping point on the follow-through. The folding and recocking of the shaft begins to slow the club down. Then the arms flexing very slightly right at the very end stop the club. That's how Mike can speed this club up and slow it down. If you watch him do a full swing follow through or a full swing, are you going to hit a ball?
Yeah, I'll hit one. I'll do one more practice swing.
Okay, watch how he's able to speed this club up, but then stop the club at the finish. One more time, please, Mike. Rev it up. And you see how quiet his finish looks. You don't see all this residual turning and bouncing of the club off of his shoulder on the follow through. The club recocks, the arms flex, and the club stops very quietly as the club is sped up and then slowed down. One more. I'm gonna rev it up.
One more.
Yes.
Yes.
Now smash it. You'll see there, just by looking at that, how tight his finish looked because of the way Mike controlled the speeding and slowing of the club. Anything else you'd like to elaborate on now, Mike?
I would like to add one piece about the feeling amateurs have about swinging too fast.
Okay.
Because you notice we're talking about all the things to maximize the club head speed through the ball with this driver. Being able to recock the club, bend the arms here at the very end of the swing. Most amateurs feel like when they mishit a ball, they swung too fast. And what they really are feeling is this club passing their hands, the arms bending. The club is accelerating, but they lose all control of the angle of descent, angle of approach. They just lose control of the club. And not because they swung too hard at it or too fast.
Right, I mean, that's the object of the game, actually, is to swing fast to hit the ball a long way. So they're not swing, you hear the amateur hit a bad shot and they don't know what else to say, so they say too fast, right? Well, it's not that they swung the club too fast, right? It would, more accurate description of that would be that they
started pulling their arms apart, started bending their wrists.
And the club, they lost control of the club, okay? So we want to make that clear because you hear that buzzword or something thrown out when a golfer, that's the sensation that they're trying to articulate.